Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on who and where you are. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the second day of the Intellectual Humility Symposium that we are hosting. And I'm delighted to introduce you to our first speaker for today, who is Anton Gollwitzer. Anton, I think you should be able to share your screen, and I'll just let you take it away.
Well, can everybody see the slides?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. All right, neat. Just going to refresh my little timer. All right, welcome. I'm going to be talking about how intellectual humility can kind of reduce false beliefs via information search. And to jump right in, I'm going to start with some bad news, which I'm pretty sure you're also aware of, given our collective experiences during the 2020 presidential election and COVID-19, and also before then, of course. There really is kind of this proliferation of misinformation and false information on the internet, as well as in like daily society and our daily interactions. So, as these couple articles I've listed here show, as well as others, really there is this widespread prevalence and persistence of misinformation in contemporary societies. And this is clearly something we want to stop, right? We want to have citizens, members of the community who have accurate information and believe things that are not false. So, what can we do to fix this? How can we reduce misinformation and false beliefs? And there's been a bit of a scramble to try and figure out different ways to reduce misinformation and false beliefs. So there's a couple different things you can do. For instance, you can kind of start basic and be like, we're going to create analytical tools and algorithms to detect fake news and misinformation on the internet, kind of like this diagnostic approach, kind of a basis to start off of. You can increase accuracy concerns online. And I'm going to admit someone into the room real quick. That can help people reduce the sharing of misinformation online. You can do this in different kind of cool ways. Oh, now I'm stuck because I accepted someone into the room. Oh, there we go. So one really neat way to do this is you can have like crowdsourced judgments of news source quality that you provide people with, and this can kind of improve the quality of the information that they're sharing online. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach than this past work in terms of trying to reduce false beliefs and misinformation. And what we're going to do is we're going to take an approach to this problem that goes from the perspective of the individual. So rather than focus on changes to kind of this like online ecosystem, I'm going to ask, what tools or attributes can we provide individual people with to help them navigate away from false information and belief update towards more accurate beliefs. And I think this is where intellectual humility comes in. So, being aware of one's intellectual limitations, being open to the possibility that one's beliefs could be wrong, sounds kind of like the ideal construct to help people, belief update away from false information. So we tested this idea in two studies. We examined whether intellectual humility can predict a reduction in false beliefs. And in study one, we did this with a sample of people who held the false belief that the 2020 presidential election was rigged. So we measured the sample right after the election ended. And in study two, we had a sample of people who hold anti-mask beliefs, so who think masks really aren't that useful for stopping COVID, kind of like free the face, and that's kind of nonsense. So we chose these two false beliefs because they have had pretty important impacts, right? So believing the election was rigged is kind of directly tied to the insurrection at the Capitol that we all experienced, and anti-mask use directly leads to the spread of COVID, and I don't need to tell you about the negatives of that, obviously. So basically, we're going to see whether intellectual humility can help people who hold these false beliefs, so they already hold them, right, abandon these false beliefs in favor of more accurate information and beliefs. So, how would this even work? So let's say this works. Let's say it's great. We find that intellectual humility predicts a reduction in false beliefs. But, how would this even occur, right? Well, what's the mechanism linking intellectual humility and reducing one's false beliefs, abandoning one's false belief? What is kind of the ingredient that needs to come in for this link to occur? And I think there's several kind of possibilities. I'm going to focus on one of these. So the one possibility I'm going to focus on is that people high in intellectual humility may have a greater willingness to search for and consider counter-information. That is kind of information opposing their false beliefs. And this in turn would lead them to update away from those false beliefs. And there's actually a host of research kind of supporting this possibility. So for instance, people high in intellectual humility spend more time considering statements that are incongruent with their political beliefs. So they spend more time kind of reviewing those pieces of counter information. IH is also related to openness, to learning about politically opposing views. So generally, right, there's this idea of people who are intellectually humble tend to consider counter evidence more. They tend to consider evidence that opposes their beliefs. So to put this all together, this is kind of like the predicted model here. So, you know, intellectual humility predicts greater information search of counter evidence, right? A greater willingness to consider counter information. And this in turn predicts a greater reduction in false beliefs that people hold. And again, in study 1, we're going to look at the false belief that the 2020 election was rigged. And in study 2, we're going to look at anti-mask beliefs. Okay, so both of these studies have the same procedure, so I'm just going to kind of talk about them collectively. So the procedure you can see at the bottom of the screen here in those little boxes and the arrows, I think it's nice. At the very start of the study, participants completed a pre-selection item in both studies. And this item basically removed anyone who did not endorse the false belief in the respective study. Since we're trying to examine, right, whether intellectual humility reduces false beliefs, we only want to include people in our sample who actually right, hold these beliefs. Right, if you don't hold these beliefs, we can't reduce it, you already don't hold it. So here's an example for the pre-selection item in the first study. I'm going to kind of focus on the study a little bit more in terms of the methods, just as examples. So participants in that first study right at the beginning of the study read, the 2020 presidential election was rigged against Donald Trump on this 1 to 7 scale. And we only included participants who responded above 4 on this scale. We also had a bunch of weird, complicated checks to make sure people weren't like re-signing into the study and changing their answers. After that, so participants who were then included, right, those who actually, you know, believed that the election was rigged or endorsed anti-mask beliefs, they all completed 3 different measures of intellectual humility that have been validated in past work. Leary measure, Porter-Schumann, and Haggard. So, you know, example items here are, you know, I question my own opinions, positions, and viewpoints because they could, in fact, be wrong. Kind of good news, right? These measures all had high inner measure reliability and high inner item reliability. So they really seem to be capturing this kind of latent construct that we're trying to get at, which is intellectual humility. So after the intellectual humility measure, we assessed participants' endorsement of their false beliefs. So this is like a false belief measure and at baseline, right? So, you know, participants' endorsement of the false belief depending on the study, so that the election was rigged or anti-mask beliefs. So in study 1, this is just an example item. There's like 10 different items. So in study 1, participants read, you know, to what extent do you think there was widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election, and items like that. And then they indicated their endorsement with that on a 0 to 100 slider scale. And in study 2, anti-mask, you know, to what extent do you agree that people should be required to wear masks when in public places? That's a reverse coded item, right? So we used some reverse coded items too. Okay, we then head kind of to the mechanism, this kind of information search of counter information. So we gave participants the option to examine counter evidence to their stated false belief. So for instance, in the election study, they read, you know, we'd like to give you a chance to hear about information on how presidential elections in the United States are fair and secure. Below are several links, each of which explain a different way that the 2020 election was fair and secure, blah, blah, blah. And basically here, participants could select, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of these links, and each of the links held some kind of counter information, persuasive counter information against their false belief. They could also move on, so they didn't have to look at any of them. So if they just wanted to continue and wanted to just ignore any counter information, they could do so. As a result of this setup, the scale here is from 0 to 5, right? So 0 would indicate I just moved on, I didn't hit any of the links. 1 is I looked at 1 of the links, 2, I looked at 2, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and we also looked at, by the way, the amount of time participants spent if they clicked on the links, like how much time they spent reading it and considering that counter information, and we find consistent results with that, by the way. This is just an example of like what one of the pieces of counter information looked like in the election study. So one of the links led to this kind of statement. that basically just said, Republican leaders and election officials have said the election was fair. It then says, oh, Republican and Democratic parties, like in both parties, officials have said there was no widespread fraud. And also specifically like Republicans who are overseeing the vote in Georgia have said there's zero evidence of widespread voter fraud. So, persuasive evidence in terms of, people who are potentially in your in-group, right, are saying that actually, no, there was no fraud. Whoops. Finally, we measured the false belief measure again. So it's identical to the baseline measure just after, right, the counter evidence, the information search. We're really trying to, right, assess the change in belief. Do people's beliefs change in response to this counter evidence? And is that basically moderated by intellectual humility? Okay, so in terms of results, the first thing I want to show you is the link between intellectual humility and endorsing the false beliefs at baseline. So that is before participants saw any of the counter information, or those links, right? They weren't able to click on those yet. This is just at baseline. And this is what we find. So intellectual humility here is on the x-axis. The y-axis is the degree of endorsement of the false beliefs, right? So the degree of agreement with the false belief. The left graph is for the election being rigged, and the right graph is for anti-mask sentiments. And you'll notice something that's pretty troubling here. We actually find that the greater participants' intellectual humility, the more they actually thought the election was rigged, and the more they held anti-mask beliefs, although the second one is just marginal, right? So this is kind of, this goes a little bit against some past literature, and it's kind of interesting, like what's going on here, right? And we're not entirely sure, but there are some thoughts that we're going to go through once we see the other results, but on a very basic level, right? It's possible that people high in intellectual humility are kind of open to new information, and as such may be particularly susceptible to kind of false information regarding these two topics when that information starts to appear in society. And again, we're going to go back to this in a second when we see the other results, and I think it's going to make a lot more sense in terms of how it contrasts. The second thing I want to show you is whether participants' false beliefs actually changed. So like, did our intervention work at all, right? Like, is there any response in terms of the false beliefs in response to the counter information task? So this is a graph of participants' false beliefs. So left is election again, right is anti-mask beliefs. The red line is at baseline. And the green line is after the counter evidence task, the information search task. And further along, right on the graph indicates a greater endorsement. So it does seem to be the case, right, that people are in fact updating, right? Participants' false beliefs do seem to have reduced from before to after the information search kind of counter evidence task. Okay, so let's consider the mediation model, kind of the main point of what we were getting at, the model that our hypotheses led to. Again, right, the idea here is that we think that intellectual humility will predict greater information search in terms of considering counter evidence, and this in turn will predict a reduction in false beliefs. And I'm going to walk you through every part of this mediation in terms of the findings. So we can look at path A first, which is basically, right, like, does intellectual humility predict greater information search in terms of considering counter evidence to one's belief? Okay, so here the x-axis is intellectual humility again. The y-axis is information search. What that means is basically right, the number of links participants clicked on. So higher number of links means they considered more counter evidence, right? And we do find that intellectual humility, as kind of predicted, predicts greater information search. So a greater tendency to consider counter information to one's beliefs. And this right, this aligns with past work that has also found that intellectual humility encourages people to consider opposing views, right? And I just want to walk through the betas for a second. The betas here are unstandardized betas. It's the same across all the results I'm going to show you. So basically, let's take the left graph, right? This means that a change of 1 on the 1 to 7 intellectual humility scale predicted an increase of half a link clicked in terms of the information search. Half a link's a little weird to wrap your head around, so you can also think of it, right, in terms of like a change of 2 on intellectual humility equals or predicts one additional link of counter information clicked, right? Cool. So let's we verified path A, makes sense, goes in line with our predictions. We can consider now path B. So, does looking at counter information actually predict a reduction in the measured false beliefs? Right? Does this, reading through some of this counter information stuff, does that actually reduce people's false beliefs in that the election was rigged and anti-mask beliefs? Again, the election on the left, mass on the right. So what do we find? We find that it does. So the x-axis here is information search. So the greater information search, the more you consider the counter evidence, the more your beliefs, false beliefs decreased. Right. So the y-axis here is false belief at kind of time 2 when controlling for baseline false beliefs. So lower values on the y-axis indicate a greater reduction in terms of endorsing the false belief. So again, right, we find that looking at more counter evidence makes sense, predicts a greater reduction in false beliefs, both for thinking the election was rigged and also for anti-mask beliefs. Okay, so finally, let's consider C-path, right? We did path A and path B. C-path is basically, does intellectual humility predict a reduction in false beliefs? And we find that it does. So, the higher people were in terms of intellectual humility on the x-axis, the more their false beliefs reduced on the y-axis. So this kind of, at least tentatively, I mean, this is correlational, right? It's not causal. It at least though tentatively suggests that intellectual humility can effectively reduce people's false beliefs, and that it does so by, encouraging people to consider counter information and opposing evidence. So back just to cover the full mediation model, so kind of in line, right, with the paths that I just showed you in the two studies, right, there is a significant indirect link between intellectual humility and reduction in false beliefs, both for election and for anti-mask beliefs. That is, right, like intellectual humility predicts a greater tendency to consider counter evidence that we provided, and this in turn predicted a greater reduction in the false belief. Here's a little bonus, a little data bonus. So we also collected time 3 for the election data. What we did, we took the same sample and 2 months later asked them their endorsement of the election being rigged again. So we measured their false belief again 2 months later. So time 1 was right after the election, so November 17th. And time 1, time 2. Time 1 is basically baseline, right? Time 3 was like around 2 months later, so January 6th. And there's kind of 2 quick findings I'm going to show you here. The first thing is, and this, by the way, is not surprising, is that our intervention, so the counter evidence task, right, does not appear to have long-term effects. I mean, it'd be kind of crazy if it did, right? So specifically, we find that information seeking, so counter evidence, in terms of how many counter evidence links participants clicked, does not predict the rigged election beliefs 2 months later. Remember, it did in our one time point study, but not 2 months later. So there doesn't really seem to be a long-term impact of this this task. Again, I don't think this is particularly surprising. It'd be kind of crazy if there was something. Second, and seemingly somewhat in contrast, intellectual humility still predicted a decrease in thinking the election was rigged from baseline 2 months later. So this link that we found seems to remain even 2 months later. So like, what's going on here? That's kind of weird, right? Why is there no impact of no impact of information seeking in terms of no long-term impact, but intellectual humility still does predict a reduction in false beliefs 2 months later. And I think, and this is very tentative, but talks are kind of sometimes there to be speculative. I think maybe this is kind of a real-world demonstration of our study. So as time passed after the election, right, there was more and more convincing counter evidence indicating that the election was not rigged, and evidence that seemed to suggest it was rigged started to disappear. Right, it started to be challenged. It was like, no, that's not right. So the idea here is that maybe people high in intellectual humility encountered more and more counter evidence in the real world. Over the 2 months after our study, kind of very similar to how we provided them with counter evidence, and they looked at this counter evidence and said, oh, well, maybe I'm wrong. This kept happening over the 2 months after our study because there was a lot of counter evidence towards the election being rigged. And this in turn would explain why this relationship exists even 2 months later. But again, very speculative, but an interesting point. And kind of in line with this idea, I kind of want to go back to that positive link between intellectual humility and thinking the election was rigged at baseline. Remember this kind of troubling finding where you're like, wait a second, why like intellectual humility predicts a greater false belief in terms of the election being rigged at baseline. So let's contrast that with the finding that intellectual humility predicts a greater reduction in thinking the election was rigged, even 2 months later. So if you take these two things together, right, I think what you can at least tentatively conclude is it seems that people high in intellectual humility may be kind of quick to pick up or take up new false beliefs and conspiracies when they appear in society. But then at the same time are faster to abandon those false beliefs than others when more accurate kind of counter evidence starts to appear and they encounter this counter evidence in society. Again, very tentative, but I think it's a really interesting finding in terms of considering next steps and future research. Okay, so what are the overall kind of results? What's the overview here? So first of all, there does seem to be a link between intellectual humility and reductions in false beliefs in response to counter information. And this link appears to be driven in part by a greater willingness of people high in intellectual humility to consider available counter information and kind of investigate that information and be open to that information. And finally, intellectual humility may predict kind of adopting false beliefs and kind of new misinformation when that false information starts to spread in society, but then also abandoning these false beliefs at a faster rate after receiving persuasive counter information. There are some serious limitations to this study, so take it all with a grain of salt. First thing, it's not causal. This is a problem, especially in terms of like mediational design, right? It's kind of nuts to do mediation entirely correlationally. So we are, of course, looking at redoing these experiments with different contents, but in a causal manner. So directly manipulating intellectual humility. There's no long-term impact. I'm not even sure if this is that much of a limitation. It'd be kind of surprising if there was, right? But at the same time, right, there may be a long-term impact if you created a study or an intervention where you kept feeding people accurate information over time, right, where you keep giving them this accurate counter information. And as I noted earlier, maybe this is exactly what kind of happened in the case of the rigged election study. That is, people high in intellectual humility were updating over time in response to persuasive counter evidence that the election was not rigged, and that's why we still see that link 2 months later. All right, let's take a final quick step back. What's kind of the take home here? I think there's a couple, but this is the one I kind of want to leave off on because in terms of thinking about these results and analyzing this data, this is kind of what kept sticking in my head. So I think at least tentatively the results kind of indicate that intellectual humility on its own might not be kind of powerful enough or effective enough to reduce false beliefs in society, right? Because we did find that intellectual humility actually related positively to holding false beliefs at baseline. However, when we provided people with accurate information countering their false beliefs, right, people high in intellectual humility did show a greater willingness to update their false beliefs, right, a reduction in their false beliefs. So if you take these two things together, this indicates that, if you want to reduce false beliefs in society and misinformation via intellectual humility, and I think we definitely should do that and should try to do that, we need to kind of take two different components into account. Right? Not only do we need to increase people's intellectual humility, but we also need to make sure that the environment that they're in has a high degree of persuasive, accurate information that is available for them to consume, right? Like accurate counter evidence to ensure that they actually pick up accurate information rather than inaccurate information. And I think we can definitely do this, but it's going to require a lot more work and more research and maybe even some real structural kind of changes in society, kind of going back to those original studies I talked about in terms of how to change misinformation prevalence online, right? So if we change the environment and change the individual collectively, then we might really be able to reduce the prevalence of false information in society. All right, so that's kind of my 2 cents. Thank you to Irmak Okoze-Akten and Gabriel Ettingen, who are collaborators on this project. They're also, part of a bigger project, and this work that I just showed you is part of a bigger project where we're trying to develop individualized interventions to heighten intellectual humility, to harness kind of the beneficial outcomes of intellectual humility, including reducing false beliefs. And this kind of takes a machine learning AI approach. So if you're interested in those kind of topics, feel free to reach out. I obviously want to thank the Templeton Foundation for their really generous support. Without it, I mean, none of this would have been possible. And it's been really a pleasure to work on this topic. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I want to thank the organizers of this really great symposium. It's been really fascinating so far, and I'm excited to hear the other speakers. Cool. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anton. We have 5 minutes and 5 questions.
Sorry.
So I'll assign the first one to Jay and ask people to be as concise as they can.
Great talk, Anton. I love the longitudinal data and the mediation model. My question is that, as you know, these specific topics of misinformation you selected are highly correlated with political partisanship in the US. And so I'm wondering if you looked at the correlation between intellectual humility and partisanship, and also, or political ideology, because it's woven into partisanship, and if that might be a suppressor effect of belief.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, so in terms of suppressor backwards. Yeah, so the results are consistent when you control for political ideology. There is, of course, somewhat of an issue though, because if you select for people who hold these beliefs, like they're already quite conservative. So there's not that much variance moving around there. I think we did find, but I have to double check that intellectual humility correlated kind of with being less partisan or less conservative. So that would be in line with the suppressor idea. So I'd have to look into that more, but I think it's a great question. But overall, the findings do seem consistent, even if you account for the variance within kind of the conservative sample that we have.
Thanks. Next up is Aleksandra.
Thanks. Thanks, Anton, for a really interesting talk. You mentioned, you kind of described this mostly in terms of supporting versus abandoning these false beliefs. But I'm interested, I think, a little bit in the confidence with which people held these beliefs. So just to kind of, I think it's really interesting to what you were discussing when it comes to the fact that intellectual humility might sometimes be linked to holding false beliefs, because these people might be just more curious and just search for this information. But I'm wondering whether sometimes intellectual humility might also lead to sort of lower confidence with, one side or the other. So for instance, where it comes to, say, convictions about vaccines right now, I think the problem really is with people who are just not sure about vaccines, because the hardcore anti-vaxxers are never going to be persuaded, right? But I'm just curious whether the intellectually humble people might actually be those who are sort of uncertain because they're trying to weigh different evidence. So I guess my question is about the role of certainty in these beliefs.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, well, there's so many things I want to say. Okay. So one thing is that, so the fact that they do seem to, people who are intellectually humble do seem to update in terms of counter evidence does indicate that their beliefs in these kind of scenarios are more malleable. So you're exactly right in terms of, like, if we're going to target, people to try and encourage vaccination, this would be a perfect scenario where that is possible. So it's interesting because there's this differentiation between, do I hold the beliefs and how strongly do I hold it, and also how malleable it is. That kind of seems to shift. So for people who are highly intellectual humble, it's more malleable, but at the same time, they actually more strongly endorsed those beliefs to start. So those can actually be pulled apart, which creates this really fascinating world where you could really hold a belief with high confidence, but then hold the other belief with high confidence tomorrow, right? And this kind of malleability is very interesting. Also, I'm sorry for using the words abandon or eliminate or whatever. It really is, of course, a fluctuation in how much you agree, right? How much,
of course, it's a simplification, but that kind of made me think about this, this issue. Yeah.
For sure. No, that's an awesome question.
Great. I think next up is Marco.
I think you're muted.
Can you unmute Marco? Is there a way for us?
You need to unmute me, exactly. You blocked participants unmuting. Anton, thank you so much. That was fascinating. The two very small questions. One, you had 3 measures of intellectual humility. Which one is best? And the other question, I wonder whether there's a version of the study where you test for intellectual humility at time 3. So otherwise, someone might argue, part of the intervention is that you're asking people about their intellectual humility. Now they really want to stay consistent with what they just said about clicking on a lot of links. So they're
Yeah. We did reverse it in a different study and find consistent results where we measure intellectual humility after the counter evidence task. So you can move it around.
But after time 2, not after time 3.
Yes, not exactly. So you're still right in terms of the time 3 point. Yeah. So it doesn't seem to be the case that we're priming people with their intellectually humble responses, and that in turn activates it. Although, if it did, that would just support causality, so that'd be kind of neat. Yeah, and in terms of the measures, which one's better? I don't know, but what I do know is that there's no moderation among the submeasures. So the results I showed you, none of them are moderated by the specific submeasures. So they seem to be consistent across all 3. Yeah.
Cool. I think next up is Katerina, if we can get her to unmute.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. That's really interesting work. So what I wanted to know is, people who hold false belief don't know necessarily that they hold false belief, right? So all they do is search for counter information in this case. So likewise, if you hold a true belief and you always seek counter information, you could end up more wrong. It could go both ways, depending on where you start out, really, if counter information is your strategy. And I was wondering what you have to say about this. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's 100% right. I mean, this is probably why intellectual humility positively related to those false beliefs at baseline. It's because those people were walking around being intellectually humble and heard all this information that the election was rigged, right? They're conservatives, they're in their conservative communities. Oh, there's all this information, the election was rigged, and they're the most likely to pick it up. So that's exactly right? It's the information, it's the openness to that information. And then it's the openness to the counter information. So it has that malleability component. So 100% right. This very well may explain why we find those results in the beginning at baseline that are kind of troubling, where you're like, what's going on? Why are the intellectually humble people endorsing these false beliefs even more? But it's because they probably picked it up right at the beginning when that information is starting to appear in society. You immediately pick it up. You're quicker to pick up that information, and then you're more quick to update it. But yeah,
Thanks.
That's awesome. That's exactly it.
Thanks. Can I have a small follow-up?
Yeah, of course.
Just a very small one, which is, so here you only looked at looking for counter information in terms of information seeking strategies. Would it make sense then to look at other strategies, such as looking for balanced evidence, for example, so more evidence and not necessarily in one direction, and whether intellectual humility actually really goes along with only looking for counter evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's 2 things there. The first one would be like, let's say we had accurate information and inaccurate information, and then we see whether people who are intellectually humble will look more at one than the other. I don't think so. It's possible, right? I don't know of any research that's done this. If it has, I'm sorry, and that's super cool, right? The idea that if you're intellectually humble, you're more likely to pay attention to accurate than inaccurate info. That's awesome. That'd be cool. But in terms more of your question, right? If you have the situation where you have opposing versus non-opposing views, there are a number of different studies who have replicated that if you're higher in intellectual humility, you are more likely to spend time on opposing views than if you're lower. But in terms of the non-opposing views, there's no difference. IH doesn't predict anything. So it does seem to be that really it's the counter evidence where the music is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Great. If we can
Sorry.
Quickly hear from Catherine Hundleby, that would be fantastic, and then we'll turn things over to our next speaker.
Great, thank you. This was a really interesting talk, and I'll try to be quick because I think my question is just a bit me not being clear on something. I was really interested in what you were talking about, but I was curious about the measure of intellectual humility, because it seems to me I wasn't quite clear what you were counting as intellectual humility, and it seemed like it might be set up to being disposed toward openness to information or seeking new information, whereas intellectual humility could also be understood in a different way, as a willingness to trust. It seems to me that when you're open to new information, you're also trusting your own ability to sort it out, right? Rather than just defer to an authority.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. In terms of the measures we use, they some of them have some subdimensions in terms of these kind of things, but they tend to be more like, right, so it's like, I'm willing to admit I'm wrong. That's kind of a subdimension. Then subdimension of, I kind of need for cognition, right? Like I want to learn about new things. I want to, examine the world. But that differentiation between kind of trusting oneself and being open to that one's beliefs might be wrong in a sense. I don't think any of them specifically pull those apart. I might be wrong, but yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point in terms of delineating. What are the kind of the subdimensions of intellectual humility that would differently predict these things, right? Absolutely.
Thanks.
Great, thanks so much. We're going to move to our next speaker, Aleksandra Cichocka. Aleksandra, can you share your screen and get started?
Yes. Can you see the screen okay? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. So thanks for having me tonight. I'm especially happy to join this super interesting symposium because it's a Saturday night in England and it's raining and we're only allowed to do drinks outside. So thank you for offering me another fun way to spend the Saturday night. But I'm also very pleased to be here and listen to all these exciting talks about intellectual humility, especially because this is not really a topic I typically study. I am more interested in the opposite, so in vanity, arrogance, and narcissism. But I actually think that one reason why intellectual humility is so interesting is the sort of pervasive lack of it around us, at least on social media and in politics. So one of my favorite online games is a website where you are asked to decide who tweeted it, and basically deciding whether Donald Trump or Kanye West tweeted some really outrageous, typically very arrogant statements, and many of which actually do describe very well what lack of intellectual humility might be. And if you're interested who tweeted this one, it was indeed Donald Trump, although it's not an easy game. I encourage you to take it. And this actually, I think, illustrates quite well that lack of intellectual humility is basically, or at least some components of lack of intellectual humility might include intellectual arrogance about one's intellectual capabilities and knowledge, as well as sort of intellectual vanity, right? So intellectual humility is associated with low concern for how one's intellect is perceived and for one's intellectual reputation. And these are two aspects of intellectual humility identified by Mark and colleagues. And these happen to be those aspects of intellectual humility that are negatively related to a broader psychological trait of narcissism, which is what I typically study in my research. So narcissism is associated with broader arrogance and vanity, not only in the intellectual domain, but also in other domain. And it is a sort of grandiose self-image that is associated with the need for finding approval in the eyes of others, entitlement to special treatment, and general, what Mitya Bach calls assertive self-enhancement. So this basically grandiose fantasies about one's capabilities, one's uniqueness and special place in the world, but also charmingness in being sort of socially bold and attractive to a degree. But these search for validation of narcissists also has a dark side, and it's also associated with so-called antagonistic self-promotion, by which those scoring high in narcissism tend to show oversensitivity to any criticism and threats to their self-image. They also tend to devalue others that disagree with them and generally show low trust, empathy, and low agreeableness in interpersonal relations. Typically, narcissism is measured with inventories such as the NPI. And here are examples of some statements that describe a highly narcissistic person. And we know from various studies that about 1 in 3 university students and about 1 in 5 adults, at least in the US, tend to score high on measures of narcissism. And some even consider narcissism a defining trait of the generation. So it seems pretty important to understand the implications of holding these narcissistic views of oneself. And we already know quite a lot about the role of narcissism, especially in interpersonal relations. So for example, we know that narcissists tend to be attractive because they are socially bold and they sort of stand out in the crowd. So it's easy to fall in love with a narcissist, but it's really difficult to be in a relationship with one because of these difficult interpersonal style that they have. But it's also, of course, important to understand other implications of narcissism. And since Donald Trump's presidency, I think everybody's pretty well convinced that narcissism might matter for politics and political leadership. But this has already actually been studied before Trump, when Watts and colleagues investigated the role of narcissism in US presidents. So in this study, they actually generated expert scores of narcissism of presidents. So they asked experts to evaluate narcissism of presidents up to George Bush. So this was before Trump, before Obama even. And they found that Johnson actually scored the highest on narcissism. But they also evaluated, basically they compared these narcissistic scores to both objective and expert-generated evaluations of presidents. And similarly to what we find in the sort of interpersonal relationships domain, narcissism is a double-edged sword when it comes to leadership. On the one hand, narcissistic leaders seem to be very energetic. They tend to be judged as great presidents. They are great in agenda setting, but they also are more likely to act in unethical ways, and they're more likely to be impeached. And we saw some evidence for this also in recent history. However, what I'm interested in the research I've been doing with my colleagues is more the role of narcissism in the public's political beliefs. So today I'm just going to give you an overview, a very quick run through really of some of our studies in different domains of political, social and political beliefs, and I will try to argue that narcissism can play a role in predicting some of these attitudes. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on engagement with conspiracy theories, given the broader focus of today's symposium. So let's start with political ideology and prejudice. So the idea that the way people feel about themselves might matter for political convictions is, of course, not ours, it's not new. And already Adorno and colleagues argued that self-esteem and self-evaluation might matter for political beliefs. And some of the classic theorizing in political psychology has argued that actually people who feel insecure about themselves or inferior are more likely to embrace conservative attitudes rather than more liberal positions. So for example, Snyderman and Citrin said that conservatism holds great appeal for individuals who have little confidence in their capacity to cope with their own inner needs or with the demands of the external environment, and that it provides an opportunity to attribute weaknesses and incompetence to others. Now, in these classic studies, it has been assumed that this means that conservatism should be linked to low self-esteem. However, if we looked at the theorizing, it really seems to more point to the role of defensiveness, which is more characteristic for high narcissism rather than low self-esteem. So my colleagues and I try to investigate whether narcissism might matter for political ideology more than self-esteem, especially also given meta-analytic evidence that self-esteem is unrelated or tends to be overall unrelated to political ideology. However, the story wasn't really straightforward. So some studies point to the relationship between narcissism and stronger conservatisms, and others don't. But with Christoph Dawn and Arti Makwana, we thought that maybe it really depends also a little bit more about the aspect of conservative beliefs. In a series of studies conducted in Poland, US, and the UK, we tested the associations between narcissism, prejudice, and different components of right-wing beliefs. And we found that narcissism was associated with higher social dominance orientation. So the idea that some people, some groups in the society are simply better than others and are entitled to dominating over other groups in the society. And we found that via social dominance orientation, narcissism was associated with greater prejudice. Here we looked at ethnic prejudice specifically, so people's attitudes towards other ethnicities. Interestingly, though, we found that narcissism was negatively related to right-wing authoritarianism, especially after we took out the variance shared between social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarian attitudes. And we argued that this is because narcissists are also likely to think of themselves as rule breakers, as being unique and special and not conforming to the traditional social arrangements, which is an aspect of RWA. And due to the negative association between narcissism and right-wing authoritarianism, narcissism was also simultaneously negatively associated with ethnic prejudice, which also could explain why past research might not have found any relationships between narcissism and prejudicial attitudes. But this also suggests that narcissists might be prejudiced simply to certain groups, that is, groups that challenge, for example, social hierarchies, but not necessarily to groups that challenge social norms and traditions. So I think that has interesting implications and could be integrated with, for example, Sibley and Duckett's dual process model of prejudice towards different groups. Now, in another project, we try to understand what do these attitudes associated with narcissism could mean for general support for democracy. Again, going back to classic studies on the psychology of democratic attitudes, we sort of assume that support for democracy will depend on people's willingness to participate in politics, but also especially on their tolerance of others' efforts to do so. So if we want to support democratic processes, we need to also assume that others that we do not agree with might win the election, for example, and take decisions on our behalf. And this is something that probably would not be too appealing to those scoring high in narcissism. And Snyderman, on the other hand, argued that narcissism should, support for democracy should instead be associated with psychological security, which promotes an ability to respect the views and opinions of others, even those who we disagree with. So overall, we argued that the defensiveness associated with narcissism and its confrontational nature, its intolerance of criticism, would mean it would be less likely to support democracy, but that a secure self-esteem, secure self-evaluation could in fact be associated with higher support for democracy. So one way to observe a secure self-evaluation is to basically take out the variance shared between the measures of self-esteem and typical measures of narcissism. So once this variance shared between the two sort of types of measures is accounted for, we can observe self-esteem without the defensive narcissistic component and then interpret it as a sort of genuine confidence in one's skills and abilities that doesn't require validation in the eyes of others and is basically a more accurate reflection of our intellectual and other types of abilities. So in two studies here, my colleagues and I found that indeed narcissism was associated with lower support for democracy, while self-esteem without the narcissistic component, so sort of more secure form of confidence in oneself, was positively associated with support for democratic values and institutions. Okay, so what does it mean? What implications could narcissism then have for belief in false information or conspiracy theories specifically? I think it's important to understand this, especially because, as we know, and probably I don't have to convince you, conspiracy theories can pose a real threat to democracy and social cohesion. So far, my colleagues at Kent, as well as other labs, have consistently shown that exposure to conspiracy theories and belief in conspiracy theories is linked to a bunch of social problems, including political apathy, disengagement, but also sometimes engagement in disruptive political actions, is related to prejudice and crime and violent tendencies, as well as, for example, in the context of the current pandemic, reluctance to adhere to COVID-19 recommendations. So again, we feel it's important to understand what factors in general would predict conspiracy beliefs, and here specifically we're interested in the role of self-evaluation, different types of self-evaluation in predicting conspiracy beliefs. And again, and you will see a pattern here, early work assumed conspiracy beliefs should be associated with low self-esteem. And this was thought because conspiracy theories allow people to blame others for their own problems by pointing to sort of some malevolent groups conspiring in secret, trying to undermine our way of being, our society, etc. But again, studies haven't really found consistent evidence for low self-esteem or self-esteem in general to be associated with conspiracy beliefs. And we again argued that this might be because conspiracy beliefs might be associated with psychological defensiveness, more characteristic for narcissism, which is also associated with convictions about others' malevolent intentions, and not necessarily with more secure forms of self-evaluation. So we tested very similar model, and this is generally what we found. So in one study, for example, we measured self-esteem, we measured narcissism with the typical narcissistic personality inventory, and we measured people's belief in all sorts of conspiracy theories, both political and sort of more outrageous types of conspiracies. And what we found was that at the level of sort of bivariate correlations, conspiracy beliefs were associated with higher narcissism, but unrelated to self-esteem. But when we took out the variance shared between narcissism and self-esteem, we observed that actually a secure self-evaluation was associated with a lower tendency to believe in conspiracy theories, while narcissism was associated with a higher tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. And we find this consistently across several studies. In one of them, we also measured paranoid tendencies. So these ideas that others are trying to undermine us in secret and might be out to get us. And this tendencies, to some degree, mediated between narcissism and conspiracy beliefs. However, we actually could argue that these paranoid tendencies are not the only reason why narcissists are more likely to embrace conspiracy theories. And part of it could also be that conspiracy theories offer people sort of an idea that they possess some special and unique knowledge, which might make them feel basically more special themselves. And this is something that should be attractive to those scoring high in narcissism. Now, we tried to test some of these ideas in more recent studies that conducted with my students here at Kent, in which we tried to investigate the role of narcissism in belief in conspiracy theories overall. We tried to replicate past findings, but also wanted to see how whether it would be associated with belief in conspiracy theories about the pandemic specifically. And we also wanted to investigate whether whether narcissism could contribute as well to the likelihood of endorsing or sharing conspiracy theories on social media. And here, rather than using the sort of more typical narcissistic personality inventory, we try to measure both the narcissistic admiration and grandiosity aspect of narcissism, as well as the narcissistic rivalry component of narcissism. So in order to measure people's engagement with the conspiracy theory statement, we exposed participants to one of several possible posts that were designed either to look like they were taken from Twitter or from Facebook. And by the way, the platform didn't matter for any of our results. I'm not going to talk about it more. And we also manipulated whether they were posted by a man or a woman, just to kind of take gender into account. And we manipulated whether the person posting the conspiracy theory statement was either someone who was fairly popular, had a lot of followers and a lot of engagement with their posts or not. So here's what we found. First of all, we generally replicated our past findings showing that narcissism was related to conspiracy beliefs overall. And we found that both the admiration and rivalry aspect of narcissism were associated with belief in conspiracy theories. These effects are weak, but they are very much in line with our previous findings. However, we found that only the narcissistic admiration aspect was associated with engagement with the conspiracy theory statements. Interestingly, we didn't observe any direct effects of narcissistic admiration on the likelihood to believe in the COVID-19 conspiracy theories. There were only indirect effects via the general tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. However, we found that narcissistic admiration was associated with the likelihood to like the conspiracy statement and share it on social media with others. Here, interestingly, we found that those high in narcissism or narcissistic admiration specifically were more likely to share statements that looked like they were not yet highly popular on social media, which we think points to this explanation that there is also the appeal of sharing something unique and special knowledge that others do not have access to. So it wasn't that they were more willing to share all the statements, they were especially likely to share the ones that were offering some sort of special knowledge. Okay, so overall, these previous and more recent studies seem to show that narcissism is a robust predictor of belief in conspiracy theories, and it's partially due to higher paranoid tendencies associated to narcissism, but potentially partially also due to this sort of appeal of unique special knowledge that others do not have access to. And it seems that narcissistic admiration specifically is linked to willingness to endorse and share conspiracy theories on social media. Okay, so overall, we hope that this research shows that narcissism is an important psychological trait to study in the context of political beliefs, and it can actually be a challenge to liberal democracies, being related to social dominance and ethnic prejudice, lower support for democracy, as well as belief and dissemination of misinformation, at least in the form of conspiracy theories. A secure self-evaluation, secure self-esteem, on the other hand, seems to have largely opposite effects than narcissism. So it seems that sort of this unpretentious confidence in oneself can have positive, or at least socially positive consequences. Now, I hope that some of this work might have interesting implications for trying to understand also intellectual humility or lack of thereof. Okay, so thank you so much. These are my collaborators on this project, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Aleksandra. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions, if anyone would like to raise their hand or unmute themselves.
Hey, Mark, if no one's going to ask a question, I will. So Aleksandra, I really liked the work dissociating self-esteem and narcissism because they're correlated and often conflated, and that one is like they have opposite effects on paranoia and conspiracy theory beliefs. But one thing I noted that you use the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, like the classic from like 1965, but there's different conceptualizations of self-esteem. Do you think like somebody who's like a fragile self-esteem is going to show the same effects, or extrinsic self-esteem, or like low implicit, high explicit? So how would you conceptualize those? Are they pretty similar to narcissism in these patterns, do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of debate on what defensiveness in self-evaluation means. And it used to be thought that indeed, for example, a discrepancy between high explicit and low implicit self-esteem is indicative of sort of greater defensiveness, and that narcissism might be associated with this sort of doubts deep down inside. Then this literature kind of argued that this is not the case because the studies were super inconsistent. I think some of the problems here are generally measurement of implicit attitudes, right? And we know problems, all know problems related to this. We actually, in past work, we have done some studies priming implicit self-esteem and found that it actually made people more liberal, but it's hard to replicate this given that the methods are just so flimsy, really. That was way back when I first came to NYU, actually. But there is some evidence, for example, that contingent self-esteem, so one that is like sort of dependent on others' views, which is somewhat related to narcissism because it is kind of self-evaluation dependent on others' opinions about yourself, is also related, for instance, to conservatism. So I think there's less work in that domain of politics. But I do like the classic Rosenberg scale, and because it generally captures self-evaluation more broadly. There are obviously, measures that are more nuanced about, like liking yourself versus, your skills and capabilities. And I think, it's interesting to study them. But I think, but some of these studies, we actually use just the single item self-esteem measures. I have high self-esteem, and that works. Actually, I am the narcissist also works as a measure of narcissism. People who are not narcissists find it hard to believe, but if you met a narcissist, they are happy to admit it. You know what I mean? They're not ashamed of the way they are typically. So, sometimes it's actually possible to just find similar factors, just asking about having high self-esteem or being a narcissist. So, yeah.
Thanks.
We have a question. No, sorry, that was Jay. I'll admit Aleksandra. One quick question or comment, I suppose, from me. I've been doing some work using natural language processing, evaluating the manifestos of people involved in the incel movement. And one thing that you can easily do to sort of pick out the narcissists is to look at how often they use I versus we. So first person singular pronouns versus first person plural pronouns. And I think that this kind of approach might be a valuable thing to add to the toolbox, because there's a lot of text that's sort of freely available. And it's highly ecologically valid because it's stuff that people have actually published under, sometimes even under their own names. So to the extent that you're worried about, people admitting that they're narcissists or, claiming to be narcissists when they're not, if you think these self-report measures need to be supplemented in some way, then the natural language approach, I think, can be a useful additional tool.
You're absolutely right, but actually I'll ask you, but which one was it? Because I or we? Because actually there's some studies showing that narcissistic leaders at least are more likely to use we in their speeches. So
yeah, so people who are feeling like confident and part of the group will use we, whereas people who are feeling like they're at the bottom of the hierarchy and that they're not respected will tend to use I.
Yeah, but there's some research showing that narcissism is related to the use of we pronouns as well, individual narcissism. So I think this is actually, I mean, I agree, and we're also interested in using some of this research, especially now to also capture what we call collective narcissism, which is a whole other lines of research that I didn't really touch upon here. But I think there's some nuances there, and I think it's actually, it's not always straightforward that those who are self-focused would only rely on these pronouns. But I think you're right. I think this is also the way to go to try and capitalize on these findings, because I didn't really get into details of this, but a lot of this work is of course self-reported, is of course a correlational. These are fairly stable individual differences, so they are not necessarily easily sort of manipulated or and so on. So I think that would provide sort of an ecologically valid way to do it. And then certainly the incel community is a very interesting context for this, I think, both for individual and collective narcissism. So we've been interested in that as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Aleksandra. I'm going to turn things over now to Rick Hoyle.
Thank you, Mark. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the work my colleagues and I have been doing on intellectual humility. I want to talk specifically about and make a case for the value, the conceptual value of studying intellectual humility as it refers to specific positions that one holds. And as I work my way through, and particularly toward the end, I want to refer back to some things that Heather Baddeley said yesterday about servility, that Aleksandra, some of the points of her model, and even Anton, some of the points that you raised today, all of which I believe are points on which one can get more traction by focusing on particular positions as opposed to the disposition of intellectual humility. So here's how I hope to tackle it. I'll first sort of make that distinction between what I consider two forms of intellectual humility. That is the more dispositional form that so far everyone in this symposium has referenced versus the position-specific form. I want to give you just a very quick example of a historic change of position. Then I want to talk about what I believe contributes to position-specific intellectual humility. And in unpacking that, then we can begin to think about some of these issues related to concepts that collide with intellectual humility in some of the spaces where we hope to understand the dynamics of change. So this is a definition that my colleagues and I have used for a long time. The paper appeared in 2017, but this definition came around as part of a Templeton-funded collaborative effort with a team of philosophers some years before that. And interestingly, some in that group have kind of changed their view. We've sort of held strong to this view, and I'll be curious as we move along to hear your thoughts about it. We sort of try to capture three basic, what we believe to be aspects of intellectual humility at the dispositional level, this sort of acknowledgement that what I think I know and believe, it could be fallible, that I'm appropriately attentive, and I'm picking now up on this notion that I'm not overly or under attentive, but appropriately attentive to the limitations and the evidentiary basis of that view. And then I appreciate my own potential limitations in even understanding relevant evidence as it relates to things that one might know. At the dispositional level, this corresponds to a general tendency. That is, we expect it to have characteristics that look very much like personality or say low-level traits in broad personality domain models. In fact, some years ago, we did a study in which we followed a cohort of college students actually at 4 universities across the 4 years of their university education. We had the good fortune of having a measure of intellectual humility when they just arrived at university, and then we caught them about a month before they left. In part, we were just interested in whether getting an education changes how you view your own understanding and thinking about the world. I'll just note that the particular measure, and this is the Leary et al. Measure that Anton mentioned earlier, nicely reliable over time, alpha 0.82 on both occasions. Interestingly, over an almost 4-year span, the correlation is about 0.41. The question is, did people change much? So one thing about determining changes, you have to be able to take into account unreliability in a measure. So this reliable change index suggests to us that really the only change that's reliable is any change of about 3/4 of a scale point or more. So if we use that, and this is on a 1 to 5 metric. So if we use that criterion, one question is, would our hypothesis be true that getting an education increases your intellectual humility because you learn there's so many things you thought you knew that you didn't? Turns out it doesn't do that at all. And in fact, what we essentially find is much like a disposition, like we would expect a disposition to behave, about 3/4 of people do not change in their level of intellectual humility across 4 years, and really across any 4 years, that would be impressive. But this is particularly impressive because it's 4 years of a period of time in which one is acquiring, confronting new knowledge on a routine basis. Contrast that with position-specific intellectual humility. So here we are basically playing off of the same definition, except that here now, rather than referencing a general tendency, we're talking about a particular position that I hold. So that with regard to that position, then I realize it could be, my understanding could be fallible, that there could be limitations to the evidentiary base of that particular position that I hold. And in fact, I may be limited in my ability to obtain information related to it. So in effect, then we're essentially taking the same concept from a dispositional level and moving it to a position-specific level. Our model sort of posits that intellectual humility at a position level is a function of 3 things. Actually, the third thing really is an amalgamation of a number of things. That is, certainly my intellectual humility at the dispositional level matters. So on average, you might imagine that most things I would be willing to at least entertain the possibility that I'm wrong. Importantly, and Anton, this is where I'll comment on some of the questions that came up around your work, the particular position I hold matters. Turns out extremity matters a great deal as in terms of my intellectual humility with respect to a given position, and then the bases for that position. And in particular, by basis, I mean 2 things. I mean, what are the sources of information that are available to me as they relate to that? And then Aleksandra, related to your work yesterday, what functions does the position I hold serve? And the feeling is there are certain functions that would lend themselves to a more humble adoption of a position, and there are others that would be quite the opposite. Just a very quick and interesting sort of example. Many of you perhaps know this example of Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great dissenter, not known for being an intellectually humble individual, but made a particularly, I think, informative change in view that captures what I refer to as position-specific intellectual humility. You're well aware in the United States Constitution, the First Amendment, that states that freedom of speech shall not be abridged. Then you may know that on a couple of occasions, Sedition Act, Espionage Act, a number of acts have been passed by Congress that are counter to that. This one, particularly around World War I, really was aimed at preventing people from exercising free speech if it was perceived to disadvantage the U.S. At war. Also, by the way, interestingly, this was around the time of the Spanish flu as well. So one interesting thing, as captured in Healy's wonderful book, The Great Dissent, is that Oliver Wendell Holmes changed his mind. He had up until 1917, held a position that free speech was logically indefensible, right? A rather extreme view against it. He argued that just as you could infringe on personal rights by requiring people to get vaccinated, which is an interesting perspective given where we are now in history, you could also prevent people from speaking freely against the US. 8 months later, however, he wrote a dissenting opinion in the Abrams versus United States case, essentially arguing in favor of free speech, except in cases of clear and present danger. Here, just it's 12-paragraph opinion, well worth a read if you wish to Google it. Here are some quotes that very much capture then, as it relates to free speech, an intellectually humble view, particularly this notion of imperfect knowledge. Interestingly, by the way, we could spend all of my time talking about the competition of the market. So a concept that first appeared in this opinion advanced by Oliver Wendell Holmes. If you, by the way, for example, consider the Twitterverse as the marketplace of opinion, interesting observation in some recent analyses is that false information travels about 6 times as fast as true information in the Twitterverse. So it's not clear that, as Oliver Wendell Holmes anticipated, that having competition of ideas would in fact lead to truth. So returning then, or thinking through just very quickly, the basis for this, if you read Healy's book, you'll see that in the case of Oliver Wendell Holmes, it had to do with making the acquaintance of some smart and loyal young apprentices who ultimately, and then a case in which he was able to see issues with not allowing free speech. So it was the basis that changed. The point is that it's fairly clear that Oliver Wendell Holmes did not change dispositionally in terms of how intellectually humble he was. And just to give you one other kind of contemporary example, if you're a Reddit user or not, you may want at some point check out a nice Reddit group called Change My View. Interesting situation in which people essentially invite other people to convince them that they're wrong. And the concepts range from this rather trivial one about how a computer works in a particular app to more substantial ones of the sort that we might care about as a psychological scientist. Even a scoreboard for people who've done the best job at causing other people to change their views. But the point here again is they aren't trying to change people and who they are, but rather they're attempting to change what they know and understand to be true. So our first foray into this work was some work on what we'll call fundamental religious beliefs, a domain in which people certainly can be intellectually arrogant. We did a study, an early study, even before we had a measure of any sort of intellectual humility on this topic. So we had people first state their position on religious belief. And I'll just note that an important thing about how we did this was we didn't just go from I don't believe to I strongly believe. We made sure to have the complete opposing opinion. And you'll see in a moment why that's critical when one assesses extremity as it relates to positions that people hold. Following that, we had people complete what at the time was an ad hoc measure of religion's position-specific intellectual humility. Then in an experiment that I won't say much about, we had them read op-ed pieces that either opposed or favored religious practices and had them evaluate the author and the op-ed. The key piece I want to focus on here is that correlation between people's position as it relates to religious beliefs and their intellectual humility with respect to religious beliefs. Both of these, by the way, assessed before the manipulation. So in this ad hoc measure, we essentially generated a bunch of items, factor analyzed them, produced 4 factors in that particular set. What I think now we would call IH proper. And you can see this maps very well onto our definition. 3 other components that are more what I would call interpersonal consequences, though some of my colleagues would quibble with me over whether that is or is not IH proper. The point I want to make here is that you can see these patterns, and I'll show you many graphs that look very much like these. That is, if you look specifically at intellectual humility with respect to one's position on religious beliefs, what you'll see is that it's totally curvilinear, symmetrically curvilinear in this particular case. That is, the more extreme people are, the less humble they are with respect to their position on religious beliefs. Slightly less symmetric, but you nonetheless see it even when you assess these downstream aspects of intellectual humility. So how do we assess this? Most of the work we've done uses 3 rather straightforward items. One point I want to make, well, 2 things I'll say about this measure. One is that you'll see there's a blank space, and that's for essentially putting in the issue or topic that one cares about. Importantly, however, and this will be relevant in a moment, these items are very much like the items on the dispositional IH scale. So if we knew nothing else about these constructs, we would expect it to be highly correlated with dispositional intellectual humility. So we have administered this measure in any number of studies now in which we've asked about many topics and many issues, essentially filling in that blank with the words you see here in parentheses. And we have people fill it out. We spread them across surveys. We isolate them in surveys so they don't affect one another. And for those of you who care about psychometrics, the measure operates identically regardless of issue. It's invariant across topic. Here, I think, is the interesting thing. As I mentioned earlier, we would expect the correlations with general or dispositional IH to be high. These are rather unimpressive, apart from the politics one. You can see down at the bottom, the lowest one is for vaccination. That is, my dispositional intellectual humility is scarcely related to my intellectual humility as it relates to the position I hold on vaccination. Furthermore, if you look within the matrix itself, you can see these two are, they're certainly significant. They're certainly moderate, although they're rather small with vaccination. The point is they're far from perfect. That is, the humility with which I hold an opinion about gun control is not the same as the humility with which I hold an opinion about vaccination. They're related, and we would expect them to be related because we believe that dispositional intellectual humility plays into that rating. I could show you dozens of these curvilinear graphs. I could show you particularly ones that show on the left or the right politically. You get the same kind of a graph. Interestingly, it used to be symmetric. Now there's a little less humility on the right compared to the left, but at both extremes, you see a reduced level of intellectual humility. This is a very recent related to my position on the trustworthiness of political news. Pretty much any topic you put in, this is what you tend to see. So in that equation that I showed you, this P position tends to matter a great deal. So what might the bases for one's position be, and when might they matter? Well, we have typically allowed for some number of choices for people to suggest to us, well, why is it you hold the position that you hold? On what basis do you hold it? And interestingly, and I'll come back to this in a moment, the more people have spent time studying it, that is, researching it on their own, the less intellectually humble they are with most topics. And this turns out to be particularly true with vaccination. And I'll say now a bit about a study we've just sort of finished, as is the case with so many COVID-related studies, looking specifically at vaccination position-specific IH. And I think vaccination is a very interesting case in ways that you'll see as we move along. So this is a large study. We've been following a sample of adolescents, about 2,000 of them for now half a dozen years. The last couple of years, we picked up at least one of their parents. Last study, we picked up just under 600 of their parents. We surveyed them last fall, early winter, prior to the availability of vaccines. And in that study, among the many other things we asked them about dispositional intellectual humility, position specific for both vaccination and some number of other topics and issues. We asked them about the degree to which they were adhering to mitigation behavior recommendations. We asked particularly about vaccine hesitancy, where they get their information and how much they trust different sources, and then their beliefs about why you should or should not get vaccinated. So we offer them, in terms of bases, a number of possibilities in terms of what they might view as their own basis for their vaccination opinion. Just like that negative correlation I showed you earlier, we see the same thing here. When I, based on my own experience, have come to a conclusion about a particular topic, I tend to be less humble with respect to my position on that topic. You'll also see, by the way, and this is encouraging, that the more they have based their opinion on experts and their doctor, then the less humble they are about their position. So this gets to the earlier question, I think, by the way, about confidence, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. So a primary variable in this data set, and in general in this kind of work, is vaccine hesitancy. We use the World Health Organization 3-item measure. Is it safe, effective, and important to have? And essentially what we find, by the way, we find very little correlation between dispositional intellectual humility and any of these variables related to vaccination. I already showed you the values in this first column. I'll just note the corresponding values in this second column. That is, people are, in this case, the more intellectually humble they are, the less hesitant they are. And similarly, the more intellectually humble they are, the lower their trust of scientific research and their doctor. So there's something then about being at the upper end of intellectual humility on this particular topic that suggests more the servility idea or the lack of confidence idea that we've talked about. Before. A couple of things to show you here. As I noted, dispositional IH is essentially unrelated to whether people would be willing to get a vaccine. Interestingly, it is virtually uncorrelated with their IH on the particular position they hold with respect to vaccination. And then just very quickly, I'll take you through a little model trying to predict. Our sort of model suggests that people's position on an issue affects how the views they hold about that issue, and then has downstream consequences for how they behave. And in this particular case, we've seen in the data that how people stand with respect to vaccination is particularly related to whether they believe it is, I do it because it's good for me, or I do it because it's good for people in general. And in fact, this is a mediational model which in effect, we basically show that the more humble people are, as we noted, again, the more hesitant they are, and therefore the less willing to get the vaccine. So then to kind of conclude with some things I hope we can maybe discuss a bit, why would we care about intellectual humility as it relates to specifically particular positions one holds? Well, I just noted that it certainly involves dispositional IH, but it involves other features of one's position. Importantly, it's only modestly correlated with dispositional IH. So therefore, if we only measure dispositional IH, I think we would miss an important view of how people interact with particular ideas they hold. It's modestly correlated across topics and issues. And importantly, and to the sort of get to what the title of the talk is, I think that in some cases, when evidence is clear and consistent, people actually become more confident and have greater conviction, and therefore not arrogant, when in fact they seem to be scoring lower on intellectual humility. So why consider it? I think there's certain payoffs to considering it. I don't think the likelihood of changing a person's disposition as it relates to IH seems to me to be unlikely. The possibility of bringing into question the basis for their position, their need to consider alternative views seems much more tractable to me. I think it's a way to understand servility and other aspects of what seems to be intellectual humility. And I think it offers a better way to think about functional views of attitudes toward knowledge. So with that said, I'll thank the many colleagues who have worked with us on this and the people who funded the work, and I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Rick. Really appreciate it. Do we have questions from anyone in the audience? I see a lot of applause. So I'll ask a question. So, Aleksandra has a question. Great.
Oh, you can go first, Mark, though, if you want to, or.
No, go ahead. I'm talking too much.
I guess it's maybe not only a question for Rick, but I'm actually surprised by that even the sort of topic specific IH didn't show strong relationships, right? I mean, there were significant effects there. But I guess that made me think about whether there are any curvilinear effects and whether you typically test for them. So, because I mean, I know that measures of intellectual humility try to differentiate it from intellectual servility and so on, but I'm just curious whether a moderate level of intellectual humility might be desirable or most useful. So yeah, is there sort of an optimum level of intellectual humility that might matter? So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, good question. And I'll just say, maybe I zipped through those figures too fast, but I guess I feel like I have somewhat of a corner on the market and looking at curvilinearity. I mean, we always look at curvilinearity because we believe generally that many of the relationships involving IH are curvilinear. Strangely, however, in the vaccination case, it has not proven to be true, much to our disappointment. Even though all the evidence suggests that that there is a body of knowledge about vaccination that is convincing enough that many people simply are never going to score high on humility as it relates to their position there if they're attending to the evidence. So you would expect the middle to be the sweet spot, that there's some slim chance I probably should think about other views, but by and large, in this case, I feel like it's settled on that position. So we do look at curvilinearity always, and I would recommend it for anybody looking at intellectual humility as it relates to other concepts.
I'm sorry if you mentioned it and I skipped it because you talked immediately after me, so I was a little brain dead.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
I think Marco is next.
Oh, you're muted, Marco.
Great. Thanks for unmuting me, Mark. Yes, I can't do it. It's prohibited. Thank you for the talk. That was absolutely fascinating. And I was wondering whether we should start to differentiate between two phases of forming beliefs. The time when you're making up your mind, you don't yet know, are these new vaccines safe? You haven't done your research. And after that phase, when you feel you've actually seen quite a bit of evidence, you may be open, to reconsidering, but you have closed that phase in which you very open-mindedly attended to evidence. Have you explored those relationships in both of these phases? Is there any way of differentiating between the two?
Yeah, we have not, but what a great idea. And, like so many things, the pandemic would have been the opportunity to do it right, because I think originally everybody had questions of what even is mRNA and how do those vaccines work? And, I think there, even for people who are firm believers in getting vaccinated, there was reason to question. In fact, it was almost irresponsible to not, ask the right questions and do your research. But then gradually it became clear. So it would have been a great opportunity. We just didn't do it, and it ought to be done. And I think you're probably right. I think the term you might use is calcify, is at some point that you maybe one's view becomes somewhat calcified, in which case then again I may be seemingly low in intellectual humility simply because I believe I've got it right. I've done my homework, and my conclusion is that the preponderance of evidence is clear.
If there are no other questions, I'll just make a suggestion, which is that what seems to be happening in several of the talks today is people are disposed to trust themselves versus trust others in different ways. And part of the tricky business is deciding when you should trust yourself versus when you should trust others. And it's never going to be the case that you should always trust yourself, and never going to be the case that you should only trust other people. And intellectual humility, to the extent that it helps with this kind of decision making, is sort of pointing people to either trust themselves in this case or trust others in that case. And that's where sort of practical wisdom or something like, a bit more nuanced comes into play, which may be hard to measure with a self-report scale.
Yeah, even discernment, because I was thinking, just as you were saying that, of that early video where 5 or 6 supposed physicians suggested that, COVID was not real. I forget now what exactly the video said, but it seemed that credible sources of information were suggesting that we really shouldn't worry about the pandemic. So if my metric of trusting others is their degree or their credentials, then that's not discerning enough, right? And the question then becomes, what sort of discernment allows me to determine when the evidentiary basis is satisfactory?
Yeah, I'll turn things over to Katerina, and then we'll have our fourth and final presentation.
Thanks. I just have a brief question. So on the one hand, you showed this result that the more you know or the more information you have, the less humble you seem to get. But then I thought of another phenomenon like the Faust idea, Goethe's Faust. So the more you study, the more you realize how little you know. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if is this maybe a question of quantity versus quality? Is there a way of, I know that there's some evidence also that the more you actually the more you know about how something works, for example, a mechanism, the more you understand how little you actually know about it.
Yeah.
So is there a way to reconcile these two sort of sets of findings?
Yeah, my first thought would be that very first graph I showed, we thought that's exactly what we would see in college students, that, and in particular, we even looked at particular disciplines and asked if for highly technical, complex disciplines, is it possible that you realize some things are just almost beyond all of our grasp, and it just wasn't there. My suspicion is it's a matter of which aspect of intellectual humility you're referring to. In other words, I can come to the conclusion that there's a lot more I need to learn to really have a strong opinion. But at the same time, I can come to, well, I sure know a lot more than I did before. And in that sense, then, I'm further along in my understanding. By the way, all that only makes sense, by the way, with a specific position, not in a broad dispositional sense. So even that very question, to sort of underscore the point I was making, is only a reasonable question to ask as it relates to a certain kind of knowledge.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rick. Thanks, Katerina. I'm going to turn things over now to Philip.
Thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Your screen is showing us ourselves.
Is it
Great.
Not showing you myself now? Yourselves. Someone's self. Is it good now? Yeah. Cool. Okay. Let me just minimize it also. Okay. Oh, hi. So I'm going to share with you some new and sort of ongoing data that we have on intellectual humility and how it relates to attitudes and beliefs during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'll touch on some of the themes that we've been talking about today already. This joint work with Mark, Robert Ross, and Jay as well. So for some context, of course, as you all know, we're living through this big COVID-19 pandemic, and amongst other things, I mean, what the pandemic has highlighted is sort of the importance to get large amounts of peoples to coordinate their behaviors in novel ways, and for governments and policymakers to communicate this. And as we've seen over time, this it turns out to be quite difficult, and people get annoyed and start protesting in ways that are unsafe for themselves and for others. And we see, as we've been discussing a few times already today, sort of spread of beliefs and misbeliefs and conspiracy theories, which again, not only are sort of misbeliefs and sort of bad for that reason, but again, actively harmful probably to the people who hold them and to other people around them. So in this context, we're trying to understand different predictors that for beliefs or attitudes that are relevant in these kind of situations. And the sort of hope is in the long run that if we understand this well this time around, then maybe the next big global crisis will be better equipped as scientists to contribute to the sort of decisions that policymakers make and to help sort of enact good outcomes for societies at large. And this work, so of course, we're interested in intellectual humility, or in particularly a facet of intellectual humility called open-mindedness. I'll get to that in a few slides. And we went to this with two sort of main hypotheses. One is that open-mindedness will correlate, so the degree of open-mindedness participants have will correlate with the public health related attitudes and behavior. And we also have hypothesized that open-mindedness will correlate with belief in COVID-19 related conspiracy theories. And to test this, we accessed a large data set that was collected in the early stages of the pandemic, so May, June 2020. That's part of the international collaboration on social and moral psychology, and several of the people here in the Zoom today are members of that larger collaboration. And it took form of a sort of many psychology labs around the world, on forces, and collected data on participants in their own countries, meaning that we have a data set from almost 50,000 participants from 67 countries on the same measure. And so one of the measures, and then unsurprisingly, since we were contributors to this project, was a measure of open-mindedness. And this was based on Mark's intellectual humility scale, which I think Aleksandra already mentioned in her talk. It's the open-mindedness measure there is one of the facets of a four-facet view of intellectual humility, including open-mindedness, intellectual modesty, engagement, and corrigibility. An open-mindedness subscale conceptualizes open-mindedness as behavior and attitudes that reflect an acknowledgement of the limitations of one's knowledge and desire to gain knowledge or respect status, and it's assessed by following items on the right-hand side here. So things like, when I have high status, I don't mind learning from others who have lower status. And in this sort of battery of questions, there are also four important outcome measures that we'll be using throughout the results I'll be presenting for you. One was a 5-item measure of physical distancing, and these were measures such as staying at home, where participants were asked to assess to what extent they were currently doing this. So if they're staying at home as much as practically possible. Measure of public hygiene, and these are things as washing my hands with soap more thoroughly than usual. And here's, I mean, the discourse has shifted a bit, I think now, like 2021 and how we understand the pandemic, but when this was designed in April, May 2020, this was sort of part of the advice that was being sort of most publicly sort of communicated by various agencies, including the World Health Organization. And there were measures of policy support, and is in favor of closing various things like all bars and restaurants, cultural institutions, and essentially pro-lockdown support. And finally, we have a 5-item conspiracy belief measures, and these are all COVID-19 conspiracies that at the time were circulating. Things like the coronavirus was created as a cover-up for the impending global economic crash. So first of all, we can just look at the distributions of the responses. This is all over the globe, and as you see, most people, of course, adhere to physical contact requirements, wash their hands, and support measures to societies against the pandemic. But there's of course variation, and those are sort of high intercorrelation between attitudes and beliefs in this sphere. And then I think this is not very unusual. Most people, of course, don't believe in conspiracy theories, but then there's some wide range of variation across the board. And we can also look at the distribution of our open-mindedness measure, and not very unusually again, we find that it's fairly positively skewed, but there's some variation, and we see moderate correlations in the predicted directions as expected. So in order to further investigate this, we regressed open-mindedness on these 4 measures in a sort of multi-level model, and we also included a host of demographic predictors as to adjust for. This includes marital status, socioeconomic status, political ideology, number of children, gender, and current occupation. And what we find is results clearly in line with our hypotheses. So the degree of open-mindedness that participants report themselves have correlate positively with all the public health related behaviors and beliefs, and negatively with holding COVID-19 related conspiracy beliefs. So it's very nice. And in this collaboration, and this was many social moral psychologists, they're adding in various measures. There's a host of other social, moral, psychological measures that might be predictive of these relationships. So we, as a next step, added them into the model. And these are the regression coefficients that come out for these various possible predictors. Open-mindedness is at the top of each of these graphs. And the key take-home from this is, and what we find is that open-mindedness is consistently the strongest or one of the strongest predictors of all of these measures when adjusting, again, for demographics and all these other possible psychological predictors of these attitudes and beliefs. And finally, since this is we fit this in a multi-level framework, so we get the sort of coefficients on the country level for each of, so predicting the relationship across each of the 67 countries. And we didn't have any particular hypothesis about what countries would have larger, smaller relationships. But importantly, what we do find is that we see the predicted relationship in virtually all the countries that we measure. So you can see here for the public health-related behaviors where we predict a positive coefficient. We see that for none of the countries we see this nice white space on the opposite prediction side. A similar story for conspiracy beliefs. And generally, there's relatively low variance in the model between sites. There's slightly more for conspiracy beliefs, but that seems to be driven by, in some countries, with exceptionally large relationship in the predicted direction. This suggests some degree of what we call cultural universality in the role open-mindedness is playing in predicting people's beliefs and attitudes in this type of situation. So as a first summary, we find that, as we predicted, open-mindedness predicts public health-related attitudes and behavior and disbelief in conspiracy theories. So next step, and this was an exploratory step, we took the open-mindedness measure that we had and conducted, and this is supposed to be, and stated from the Mark scale, is supposed to be measure one clear sort of facet of intellectual humility. But when we ran an exploratory factor analysis on it, we found that very neatly split into two facets or factors. And one that we call learning orientation, and learn on items that express some sort of positive value of engaging with other people or about topics and willingness to learn from other people. And one factor that we spread orientation, and it seems to expect sort of negative emotion or unwillingness to engage with other people, or sort of, if you want, sort of a threat to the self or the ego in terms of relating or learning or engaging with new ideas. So we score participants on these two factors instead, and then we reran the analyses that we just presented. And here I just show the results for one of these. And we find really interestingly is for the public health behavior, then we find this learning orientation factor, this sort of positive, more kind of traditional open-mindedness conception, is the strong predictor of those beliefs and behaviors. While for conspiracy beliefs, we find the threat orientation, this negative, this unwillingness to engage with other people, or unwillingness to confront opinions different from one's own, is a strong predictor of conspiracy belief here. And the relationship is positive with threat orientation. Is sort of, you can think of this more as a intellectual or epistemic vice rather than epistemic virtue, if you want. And these relationships are not showing those graphs here, but these relationships hold if we once again adjust for the host of other predictors, and we find a similar stability across countries and sites. So we find that open-minded splits into two factors, so learning orientation and threat orientation, and seem to be predicting slightly different things in our alpha variables of interest. And finally, as final exploratory analysis, we look more closely into the role of political ideology. And as a lot of the speakers have mentioned already here in the talk, so political ideologies found to relate to both conspiracy beliefs and to the extent people follow recommendations to the pandemic. And particularly, there's growing evidence linking both sort of that participants or people of relatively right-wing persuasion are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, but there's also positive evidence showing that you find these sort of linear or quadratic relationships, such that people on the political extremes are more likely to believe in conspiracy beliefs. So what we did is we explored our two-factor solution to our open-mindedness measure interacted with participants' political ideology, taking both as a linear and quadratic term. And we'll find it sort of does, especially for conspiracy beliefs. And here I'm showing the predictions from a model. And here we have the threat orientation factor, which is a strong predictor of conspiracy beliefs. And we see this interaction with participants' ideology, that for high levels of threat orientations, the divergence between relatively left and relatively right-wing participants increases, and they're more similar at low levels of threat orientation. And here's an alternative way of plotting this. If you're coming more from the political psychology side, plotting political ideology, and then we see very clearly this nice split between the purple and orange lines, so between the high and low on threat orientation for your beliefs and conspiracy theories. So, final sort of interim conclusion, we found that threat orientation and political ideology interact in predicting conspiracy beliefs. And again, these relationships were stable across countries and sites, and seem to be sort of fairly globally stable. There was a bit more variation in this measure than in the two previous ones. To conclude, we sort of find that open-mindedness relates to socially relevant beliefs cross-culturally during an ongoing crisis. And so this is, of course, very nice, very exciting. This is, I think, one of the largest sort of investigations of the role of at least one part of intellectual humility and socially relevant beliefs. However, even given this, and this goes back to some of the themes that have been recurring on the different talks we've been hearing today, we need to do a lot more work to understand, how and if policymakers can make use of these sort of relationships. So, returning to themes that Anton was taking up, can we boost intellectual humility, or could we, for example, tailor messaging? It might be the case that people, so we can identify people who are relatively open-minded. We might be able to convince them first about supporting public health-related behaviors, and then leverage other social psychological factors such as norm adherence and social learning in order to sort of spread pro-social messages across societies. And it's not very clear exactly how to best do this or use this, but given these results, it seems like pursuing sort of the intellectual humility angle or the open-mindedness angle of this is likely to be a promising way to address future crises of this magnitude. I want to thank you for listening, and funders, and of course, collaborators and co-authors.
Thanks so much, Philip. I think the first question is from Marco. And do I need to unmute him?
Yes.
Amazing, thank you. This is great data and such a fantastic data set, and great to see that you could show those relationships in this large data set. I was also really heartened by the observation that the two factors that you identify seem to be pretty close to the thing that we're capturing in the epistemic vice scale. Right? Yep. So the first, related to learning, is really this indifference idea. and the second one around the threat orientation. I think that's a fabulous name for the thing that we never could name well, this rigidity factor. It's when I look at those items, I think that's actually quite good. That kind of convergence I find quite exciting. My question is one where I'm not sure that you can, that anyone can answer them individually on the panel, but what I'm struggling with is, on the one hand, your finding and the finding that we had with the EVS, that this general measure of intellectual humility is strongly related to outcomes, and in your case, even health outcomes, and Rick's finding that there's almost no relationship, and it's all about those specific things. And any thoughts that you or Rick have on that, I'd be really interested in.
Yeah, that is a great question, and that is sort of I of course don't know, and I don't know if this is sort of also reflecting this idea of sort of stages of belief formation or any of those sort of ideas. After hearing Rick's talk, and I was sort of in half thinking about my own talk during his presentation, but I definitely thought, I mean, so given this, and sort of also with this sort of split into learning threat orientation, which obviously we didn't sort of predict beforehand, it might be difficult to see this in earlier, smaller like validations of the scale, because of, I mean, the quantity of the data here is an order of magnitude larger than in your typical survey, right? So, I mean, given a large pile of money, I mean, I think one thing we probably want to do this again at this scale, but also then, I mean, probably get at more topic specific questions about people's meta attitudes towards them, and that might help us differentiate. It might also help at this question I was ending at, like, so what should we actually target if we're interested in sort of telling someone in a more policy position, being better equipped as a social science community in the next crisis to tell you what to do or what to do. I mean, because this is all very retrospective, right? In the end, that's my sort of take on it. But I think it's great if any of the other panelists want to chime in here.
For me, the big question that the whole lot of us who study intellectual humility have to at some point address is it a causal factor? And, it can be valuable even if it isn't, right? For example, maybe it's just a big moderator. And by your notion of targeting, maybe people who, if we have some reason to believe they're intellectually humble, then we attempt to change their view in a certain kind of way, which will be fruitless for people who aren't intellectually humble, right? Because evidence. So we have to find other ways, which doesn't require IH then to be causal at all. It just is a way of kind of thinking about where different people are as they interact with information. So I don't know how we'll get traction on that, but it's kind of a little bit off. But Philip, is sort of how I tend to think about what do those correlations mean exactly. And note, if it's a moderator, that doesn't have to be correlated at all. It just needs to, sort of divide the world into two kinds of people, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I might add, I was sort of for example, the politics interaction here, I think that probably reflects sort of for example, that's probably, we know that people, for example, in the right wing tend to, if they're in a right wing media environment, that's environments where there is more misinformation. So then that, together with sort of being high, then if you happen to be an individual that is higher on what we're calling threat orientation here, then that might lead you to sort of adopt those beliefs, but not necessarily because it's sort of just, it's an environmental effect. But it's just, so maybe we should think about these as risk factors, right? So like more than so to take more sort of a almost like epidemiological view of these things, because of course usually as psychologists, at least me come from a kind of psychology background, I tend to want to think mechanistically and causally about everything, as how do we do an experiment and tweak this little thing? But it might be better to just think about these risk factors, and maybe there's ways to tailor messaging, or so like building on like what Anton was talking about, and there's some other great research flowing around on those in that line, like sort of like tailoring information seeking or online environments along those lines. So it's sort of two different people with different dispositions, which might help. Yeah.
Do we have further questions? I'll just ask one quick thing. So I think a lot of the problems that we are seeing in the last few years and maybe the last few centuries have to do less with like whether people are willing to trust other individuals versus whether they're willing to trust people who belong to groups that they themselves belong to or don't belong to. And this sort of individual and group distinction is not reflected in a lot of the research that's been done on intellectual humility so far. So Philip, do you have any thoughts on how to measure this, how to think about it, and to what extent it's something that that needs further research?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that matters. I think, especially, I mean, so I hadn't thought about this before until we did this sort of factor analysis, and this sort of echoes sort of like what Mark said. When you look at items afterwards, it's sort of obvious. The ones that we're now calling threat orientation or whatever they are, they're very. It's a very. I mean, there's a tendency to talk about intellectual humility, right? Something we have, or our willingness to learn or engage. But a lot of learning and engagement, right, in this sort of broader point of our species is social, and we're social learners. But then if you go to social psychology in general, then any social psychologist worth their salt, and Jay is a big proponent of this, will tell you that the big thing that matters about social psychology is identity and groupiness, and that is sort of the defining and organizing characteristic of a species. So I have no doubt in mind if we had items here that capture that and ask people sort of more specifically about how they think about themselves being in one group or another, then that would filter out and differentiate. And it's likely that I think that some of the things we're seeing with conspiracy beliefs, definitely since we know the environments of conspiracy beliefs are spread or very identitarian, that those intellectual humility relationships might definitely be sort of strongly moderated by knowing who you want to update from, and actually who the source of the conspiracy theory originally was. It's not that I don't think you'd accept any. So being sort of low on intellectual humility doesn't mean that you'll accept any conspiracy theory. It has to be the right one proposed by someone from the right group. I think that's maybe not exactly what the question you were asking, but that's sort of where I would go with this. But then I happen to know that you'll be giving a good talk on next Saturday on collaborative work, where we are working on other issues. So I didn't want to say too much either.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thanks for everyone who stuck through for the whole 2 hours. We will have 2 more sessions next week on Friday and Saturday, or Saturday and Sunday, depending on which continent you're in. I'll be presenting at one of them, and hopefully I'll be awake for it. Really appreciate all of everyone's efforts, and I hope that you'll be able to advertise this to your own networks once we post the videos publicly in the very near future.
Yeah, I actually think yesterday's session is already online, actually.
Awesome. I think I'll just close things down now.